right, a little bit of a challenge. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to tell you about sources of market power in web search, evidence from a field experiment. And this project is joint work with Hunt Olcott, Juan Camilo Castillo, Matt Genskow, and Tobias Salz. Now, I don't think I need to remind anyone in the room about the most salient fact about the web search market, which is that Google absolutely dominates web search, right? Such a high and stable market share naturally has attracted the attention of regulators across the globe. In the US specifically, the DOJ just recently won a court case against Google with the judge concluding that Google has illegally maintained its monopoly. And one of the facts that was mentioned during that trial is that Google pays around $26 billion a year in payments to remain or become the default search engine on various devices. Now, against this backdrop, in this paper, we want to ask and answer two key research questions. The first one is, why is Google's market share so high? There are a couple of possible explanations. It could be that Google is simply the better search engine. But even then, you might wonder, is this just because they have access to more data? It could also be that consumers misperceive the quality of Google's competition, perhaps because they've never even sent a single search query on DuckDuckGo, Bing, or Ecosia. Finally, with figures such as $26 billion floating around, it's natural to think that default effects may play a role in influencing market outcomes. The second key question we want to ask and answer in this research project is that of the effects of various potential levels of competition policy or various remedies. Right? You might imagine introducing active choice screens, just like they did in the European Union for Android devices. You could imagine banning Google from paying for the default position, effectively switching that default to be Bing or some other search engine. And finally, you could imagine requiring Google to share data with its competitors. Now, in this project, we develop a model of consumer search engine choice that inspires us to design a field experiment that's carefully crafted to empirically assess the various sources of market power. We combine that with observational click and query data from Microsoft Bing, and all of these tools together allow us to run these counterfactuals and predict what would market shares be under these various policies. Now, today's talk is very short, so I'm going to sort of mostly focus on the field experiment and the counterfactuals here. Having said that, I need to give you a very quick summary of how we think about the situation. Essentially, we think, look, there are going to be consumers that are choosing between Bing and Google, but the first important thing is not all consumers wake up every single morning and think, do I want to use Bing today for my searches or Google today for my searches? Right? Some consumers are attentive in any given moment, and others are not attentive. And it's going to be important for us to identify how many consumers are actually attentive in that they're choosing the option that maximizes their welfare. Secondly, if you want to switch your search engine, you need to navigate the various menus. You're going to incur some sort of switching cost. Thirdly, you might be misinformed about the quality of search engines that you have never used before, right? Search engines are experience goods, so if you've never used Bing before, you might be underestimating its quality. Now, importantly, might be, right? We'll want to estimate whether you actually are. And then finally, just a flag, I know in the real world, search engines sadly don't pay you to search. In our experiment, of course, we are going to pay people to search just so that we can identify price sensitivity and so I can tell you something about consumer welfare. All right, what is this experiment I keep talking about? Well, about a year ago, we recruited 2,400 people online, and these were US adults using a desktop computer. And we asked them the standard sort of battery of survey questions and so on. But then also, crucially, we had them install our browser extension. Now, our browser extension does not have as wonderful a name as all of these tech demos we heard before. I'm never going to be part of Y Combinator with it. It's simply called Search Extension. Search Extension is a beautiful tool, though, because it is essentially a little snitch. It will tell me what search engine you used on any given day, looking even back in the past by utilizing your browser history. So for all of these people that we recruited, we could track what search engines they used. That was important because now we were going to randomize them into various treatments, and we wanted to see how did their search engine usage respond to our treatments. Now, what were these treatments? Well, there's got to be a control group. That's boring. We didn't do anything with them. More interestingly, there's an active choice group that's sort of meant to mimic the choice screen, right? We're going to ask you, what's your preferred default search engine? And then we're going to walk you through implementing it. And you can't avoid that. We're going to verify that you actually made it to that choice screen. The next group is a switch bonus group. Here, these are people that were actually going to pay some money, $1, $10, or $25, to switch their searches for 14 days. So if they previously used Google, they're now going to have to use Bing for the next 14 days, and vice versa. After 14 days, this group is going to make another active choice, like in a choice screen scenario, so that we can get some sense of how their preferences have changed. And then finally, there's this default change group, where we pay them a bunch of money to just very briefly change their default search engine. But the trick is we never remind them of this again. So we can see sort of, how sticky is that default. So this is the experiment timeline. These are all our various treatments. And the important thing to note is just we have data from day -20 to day 56. So this is actually quite a long study. We see real behavior for a long period of time. How are we going to use this study to learn about these various sources of market power? Well, I'm going to explain it using this graph, where I'm showing you Bing's market share amongst baseline Google users. So these are people that came into the experiment using Google. And I'm showing you the Bing market share over time. In the control group, you would hope it doesn't move. By the way, this is stylized data. I'm not yet showing you data. This is just to get a sense. We're going to get to data in a second. Now, in the active choice group, we would expect that on day 0, when they're making this active choice, when they get this choice screen, essentially, they're going to make a choice that's going to reveal their true preferences, right? So if they think Bing and Google are actually about equally good, then we're going to have pretty high Bing market share here. Otherwise, we might have pretty low Bing market share. That's also going to tell us about the extent of switching costs and permanent inattention, these sort of frictions that might hold you back from choosing your true default if you aren't reminded about it. Then we're going to have that switch bonus group. In the first 14 days, we're paying them money. So we're going to be able to find out, to what extent do they value being with their current search engine over that alternative, their price sensitivity, in other words. But then most interestingly, on day 15, the switch bonus group is just like the active choice group, only that they had an additional 14 days of experience of Bing. So any market share difference between that orange line and that light blue line must be because they learned something about Bing. It must be because they learned about Bing's quality. And then finally, we have that default change group where we can just see where does it sort of asymptote to. That final market share difference between the dark blue line and the orange line will tell us how much people are influenced by defaults. So let's actually look at this in data, right? This is the same graph. Now I'm just showing you data. Okay, control group, nothing much happened. No revelation there. The active choice group, also nothing much happened. That's already very interesting, right? It tells us that if you just gave people a choice screen, basically they would just choose Google, right? So as a remedy, I think that's almost immediately out of the picture if you're thinking, well, I really want to change Google's market shares. Now, another thing that this tells us is it can't be that these default positions are massively helping Google out in the following sense. If the default, if everyone made an active choice, they would be choosing something else. We're seeing they wouldn't be choosing something else, so it's not just the default that matters. What else could matter here? Well, let me show you here this orange line, the switch bonus group. Remember, these are people that are being paid between day 0 and 14 to use Bing. And good news for me as an economics professor, when you pay people to do something, they do more of it. That's good. I teach that every day, to my MBAs. So that works out. But now the interesting question is on day 15, as they make another choice, now an unincentivized choice, what actually happens? And what we see is, yes, Bing's market share goes down again. Of course, we're not paying them anymore. But it actually doesn't crater down all the way to the light blue line. Rather, it stays elevated. It settles down at about 22%. So in other words, this additional 14 days of experience with Bing really convinced some of these people to stick with Bing. And that can only work if you have misperceptions of quality. You've got to either learn about the quality of Bing or learn how to use Bing. And I'll tell you a bit more about that learning in a second. Just before then, I wanted to show you also that defaults do matter in the following sense. If I defaulted everyone into Bing, a bunch of people would stick with Bing, right? This dark blue line, it basically stable at the end of the day. These are people that we defaulted into Bing, and initially they switch, there are some clever people that switch out very quickly, and the others, they just never change. All right, so let me tell you a little bit more about this learning in the switch bonus group. We actually asked people the people who switched, we asked them before the switch and after the switch, how do you feel about Google versus Bing? Everyone agrees Google is better before the switch. After the switch, everyone still agrees Google is better, but their opinions have somewhat mellowed. And importantly, we also asked them just for free-form text responses. This is from people in that orange line at the end who stayed with Bing. And my favorite free-form text response, right at the bottom here, I realized Bing was not as bad as I thought it was. If I needed to summarize the paper in one line, it would be that line. I realized Bing was not as bad as I thought it was. All right, but moving swiftly on, we have some numbers on this, not so important. Moving swiftly on, I think this is interesting. This is how much you pay people versus their Bing market share. And these are payments for every 2 weeks, right? So even if you pay just $1 every 2 weeks, then you get a Bing market share of 32%. If you pay $25, you get a Bing market share of 3/4 in our sample. So in other words, there is a bunch of people who don't have very strong preferences. They prefer Google, but not by a lot. And then there are some people who have extremely strong preferences. $25 for 2 weeks, that's a lot of money relative to what search engines make in advertising. So these are people with extremely strong preferences. It's going to be important that they're not defaulted into the wrong search engine. All right, putting all of this together, let me do counterfactuals. Quick recap how we think of counterfactuals in my field of economics. We have all of this knowledge about how markets operate. We use that to discipline some estimates. Those estimates come from the data that I just showed you. And so there is a model going on in the background, and there are some modeling assumptions, and for sure we could quibble about those, right? In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into detail here. Please come find me if you want to quibble about them. I'd be very interested. But let me just tell you about these counterfactuals. Okay, we got to start with the status quo. In the status quo, based on our market definition, Google's market share is around 89%. We are indexing mostly on desktop here. Now, what's going to happen if we take away these frictions, the switching cost, inattention, misperceptions? Well, the efficient Google market share, that is the market share that would obtain in the absence of these frictions, is 74%. Two things are important about this. One, this is a very large number, right? Google is a great product, at least as judged by revealed preference. So if we go with traditional economics approaches of judging by revealed preference, loads of people should be using Google. However, second point, that market share is a lot less than 89%. In particular, if you invert it, right, in the efficient state of the world, Bing's market share has doubled. So that difference is the difference that you could potentially get with remedies. What sort of remedies are on offer? Well, you could do a choice screen. The problem with a choice screen is it fixes the inattention, but it doesn't fix the misperception. People won't have experienced Bing when they make their choice on the choice screen. And so that means you can barely move Google's market share, only like 1 percentage point. We're very happy with this result, by the way, because that is what happened in the European Union. So we know that the model isn't making crazy predictions here. Now, what else could you do if you only could get people to somehow have correct perceptions of these alternative search engines? That would be great, right? You're really moving the market share here. But that's going to be a hard policy to pass as a remedy. What could you do? Well, you could ban Google's payment to be the default. If you do that, you're really going to crater Google's market share. So maybe that's good news. But then this is really bad news. This is the only large welfare number we have. If you're defaulting people into non-Google search engines, a lot of them are going to stick with it, including people who really hate those other search engines. So you're going to really destroy a lot of consumer surplus. So we are saying this policy, our model says, is really bad. How can you rescue it? You can rescue it by adding a delayed choice screen. If you add a choice screen sort of 2 weeks in, 3 weeks in, after they have been defaulted into Bing, they now have that choice screen to, rescue the people who just blindly followed the default and never thought about what search engine they wanted, and the moment they think about it, they're like, actually, I want Google. So that delayed choice screen could really both lower market shares and leave consumer surplus unharmed. All right, and with that, I should conclude. This is some extra counterfactuals that just show you returns to scale. The data economies we find don't really matter. Happy to talk more about that offline, but let me conclude here. The key takeaways: defaults are extremely effective in that about 1/3 of users are permanently inattentive. And they also prevent users from learning about other search engines. How can regulators reduce Google's market share? Well, what we find is that choice screens really are not going to work. Changing the default does, but it comes with a large decrease in consumer surplus. So you need to combine the changed default with another choice screen that comes sort of later on. That is just one way that you could design a policy that respects both user choice and the fact that search engines are experience goods, so people need to get experience before making their choice. And there are several caveats for this study, as with any empirical study. I'm just going to leave that up. Thank you so much for your time, and please come see me if you have any questions. Thank you.